Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 55 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we talk about general aviation and related news. Plus, we try to bring along relevant information that pilots like you can actually use someday. Today, we're going to talk about some of the challenges of entering a traffic pattern safely, and in that context, I'll talk about the second time in 2 weeks that a plane has gotten way too close to me in the traffic pattern. And we'll also be sharing listener feedback and answering some listener questions. Plus, coming up in the news this week, an Alaska float plane pilot avoids jail time after a low buzz job that's left a man in a persistent vegetative state. There's a new way to upgrade a Cessna 172 with a glass panel that gives you most of the capability of a new Cessna G1000 aircraft. And a subsidiary of Airbus has an on-demand helicopter service, and we'll tell you the city where you can now book a helicopter seat to shuttle across the city. And finally, we'll tell you about an air race that's coming up that will replicate a race held nearly 100 years ago, but with a twist. We'll tell you where that's going to be and what the twist is. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about, what else? General aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to educate and inform you, whether you're a pilot, student pilot, or an aviation aficionado. Hopefully we'll have some fun along the way as I share my recent experiences and those from the past 40 years as a licensed pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook and the 2008 National CFI of the Year. I'm also a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20 and SR22. Now, last week in episode 54, we talked with friend of the show, Senior Flying Magazine editor Rob Mark, who gave us an update on ATC privatization. And of course, this week we're going to talk about how to avoid getting too close to other planes when you're in the traffic pattern. All this and more, and the news starts now. From the Anchorage Daily News comes the story of a float plane pilot who buzzed a Wasilla, Alaska man and hit him in the head accidentally, and that victim now has permanent brain damage. On the afternoon of June 25, 2014, Travis Finkenbinder was operating an 18-foot skiff. He and his colleague were moving 2 boats down the river for their employer. Behind them came a commercial pilot, Benjamin P. Hancock, flying a de Havilland Beaver. Hancock apparently buzzed the 2 boat operators for fun. According to the second boat operator, the plane flew about 15 feet above him. He said he then watched as it dipped even lower and grazed Finkenbinder's head. Travis Finkenbinder, now 44, fell and struck his head on the side of the boat after being hit. His sinuses were crushed, blocking his airways and restricting the oxygen to his brain. That evening, his family was told to expect him to die. But now, more than 3 years later, his wife describes him as being in a minimally conscious state. She says he can't talk, but there are moments when he's more aware of himself and his environment, and occasionally will give a thumbs up. She said that Travis has never been conscious since the moment the airplane hit him. The pilot, Benjamin Hancock, was sentenced last week to a $25,000 fine, probation, and restitution, and will be on probation for 3 years. According to an Anchorage assistant district attorney, his pilot's license has been revoked. He pleaded guilty to assault in the 3rd degree, admitting he'd hit Finkenbinder with his aircraft. Initially, Hancock told investigators that his airplane encountered a downdraft and he hadn't intended to fly that low. But according to the NTSB's final report, investigators found the cause of the accident to be his improper decision to fly at a low altitude, deliberately in close proximity to the boat operators. The victim's wife said that if what happened to my husband can give a second thought to a pilot in the future who might want to buzz somebody for the thrill of it, if it can make them just have a second thought to check themselves, that's really all I ask for. She hopes her story will shed light on unsafe flying practices. She said, in the state of Alaska, buzzing is a real issue. It's a lot more common than people know. To that, I will add that's not just in the state of Alaska. We've talked before on this program about other people who have died because of buzzing. For example, a retired airline pilot friend of mine died a couple of years ago while flying too low. And unfortunately, his granddaughter was in the plane with him and they both died. So while it may seem like fun to fly close to the ground, I hope you'll consider the unintended consequences that sometimes occur. From the Washington Post and from AvWeb comes word that last week the Federal Aviation Administration grounded helicopter flights amid concerns that harnesses meant to keep passengers from tumbling out of their seats wound up preventing them from escaping a helicopter that plunged into the chilly East River. In that accident, only the pilot got out alive. All 5 passengers died as they were all restrained by harnesses that were designed to keep them from falling out of the so-called open doors helicopter flights. And these flights are marketed as allowing you to take shoe selfies. That is a photograph of the skyline where both of your shoes are in the bottom of the photograph. Now, Paul Borrelli had a really great blog article on avweb.com. He said that the reason that helicopters are often going to flood and sink quickly when they hit the river are because of their roof-mounted powertrains, which have a very high center of mass, and hence the helicopter will always flip over when it hits the water. He said because of this, helicopters are equipped with skid-mounted float systems designed to be pre-inflated prior to impact to provide buoyancy. He also said that videos show now clearly that the floats failed, and as I looked at the video, it looked to me like they hit the water very hard, which perhaps burst one of the float bags. He says, I'm offering a thought on what kind of risk passengers thought they were assuming, but my guess is they have no clue. In order to let the customers dangle their body parts into the picture frame, in addition to the standard seatbelts, they're also strapped in with a parachute-type harness with a single carabiner restraint in the back connected to a tether. He says for obvious reasons, it's not a quick release, but it uses a screw-type carabiner closure. Because of this, the passengers are shown a safety briefing video and equipped with a knife, like a web cutter type, to free themselves in an emergency. And of course, Paul talks about how he thinks the odds of that are very slim and that there's a whole lot of risk these passengers have been taking on. If you look at the screw-type carabiners, you end up having to take 2 fingers to unscrew a portion of it before you can open it. Imagine trying to do that behind your head, upside down, in cold, freezing water. So no surprise that the FAA has now banned these type of operations until some type of quick-release tether can be installed. From Flying Magazine comes word that owners of older Cessna 172s can now go to Dynon Avionics because they have an STC that allows their Skyview system to be placed into 172s and replace the vast majority of the instruments in these aircraft. Now, the Skyview HDX includes synthetic vision, angle of attack, complete engine monitoring with CHTs, EGTs, fuel flows, and fuel computer, plus a fully integrated 2-axis autopilot that's approved for full IFR approaches. The system also includes a Mode S transponder with 2020 compliant ADS-B out, navigation and mapping with flight planning, ADS-B in for ADS-B traffic and weather, including other flight bag features. Includes backup instruments as well, provided by the Dynon EFIS-D10A. The price? Well, $2,000 for the STC, but up to $20,000 for the Skyview HDX system. And essentially, this is going to give you the same kind of capability that you might find in a brand new Cessna, but for a fraction of the price. The initial approved model list covers everything from the Cessna 172F model through the 172S model. And the approval does not restrict operation of the aircraft. It can be used both for IFR and VFR flight. From News4Jax.com, that's a TV station in Jacksonville, Florida, and from the FAA comes an interesting story that we posted over the weekend on our Patreon site, and you probably want to take a look at these photos because they're pretty interesting. Let me read the FAA statement. It says, an SR-22 aircraft landed on top of an SR-20 aircraft on runway 27 at the Palatka Municipal Airport in Palatka, Florida today. And by the way, Palatka is a little bit southeast of Jacksonville. It's a non-towered airport. They say the SR-20 landed on runway 27 first, and the SR-22 then landed on top of the other aircraft. Local authorities report there were no injuries. The FAA will investigate. Well, you got to take a look at this picture because literally the SR-22 is straddling the SR-20. That is, the left landing gear is in front of the rudder and on the left side of the SR-20, whereas the right landing gear is on the right side of the SR-20. So this aircraft literally is on top of, in kind of the middle of the other aircraft. Now, here's the most scary thing of all. The propeller from the SR-22 basically totally chopped away the roof of the SR-20 over the rear passenger seats. Now, I think if there had been rear passengers, good chance some of those people would have had head injuries and possibly died. Very, very, very lucky that this aircraft didn't land perhaps 3 feet farther forward of where it landed. Now, according to the Florida Highway Patrol, the plane was piloted by former Jaguar Robert Meyer in an aircraft that is partially owned by former Jaguar tight end Kyle Brady. Now, we could sit and speculate about how this happened. All I can tell you is that there have been multiple photos that are similar to this been taken in the past since this occurred. I've seen photos of a Bonanza on top of a Bonanza that occurred in New Mexico about 10 years ago. There's another photo of a Piper low-wing aircraft on top of a Cessna high-wing aircraft. Now, that makes total sense because it's pretty hard to see each other with that kind of wing configuration. In the case of the New Mexico crash, one of the pilots did not talk on the frequency and give their position. So radio communication is really key, and it'll be interesting to see what the NTSB has to say about this accident. In the meantime, though, go out to our Patreon page, aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you're going to want to check out these photos, and this is an open blog post that anybody can see. From iPadNews.com, DUATS is dead. Well, DUATS, of course, was the U.S. government program for retrieving weather briefings and filing flight plans without having to talk to flight service. And that seemed like a big breakthrough when it was introduced back in 1989. Of course, that really predated the internet. And it pointed the way to a new, more efficient pre-flight planning process. Now, newer pilots may not believe it. Back in the mid-1990s, DUATS was viewed with the same awe and respect as some of the electronic flight bag apps like ForeFlight that you see today. But this is all coming to an end. The DUATS website will be shut down starting in May. And the most practical reason is that all those electronic flight bag apps have completely revolutionized how most GA pilots plan flights and file flight plans. And DUATS is really just regarded as being outmoded expense that the government no longer needs to fund. Now, of course, it was a free service. If you're still looking for ways to do those kinds of things, you can still find free services like 1-800-WXBrief.com, or flightplan.com has a free app as well. But just hard to believe it wasn't that many years ago. We had to have a telephone line plugged in the back of our computer. You'd use the modem and you would dial up DUATS and get back all your weather information. So anyway, if you haven't seen DUATS before, go ahead and run out to www.duats.com before it signs off forever in May. From TransportationTodayNews.com comes a story that the Department of Transportation has begun accepting proposals from flight schools that would like to be part of the Forces to Flyers research initiative. Now, that initiative is looking at strategies for training military veterans as commercial pilots. According to Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, this initiative will help address our country's serious pilot shortage, as well as provide a career path in aviation for our country's veterans to whom we owe so much. Proposals will be used to determine which schools will receive federal funding to provide flight training to veterans and will establish the minimum requirements for veterans interested in participating in the initiative. Schools selected to participate will offer veterans private pilot certificates, instrument ratings, commercial, multi-engine, CFI, and CFII certificates. One school in each of the following regions will be awarded a contract: Western Pacific, Northwest, Mountain, Central Great Lakes, Southwest, and Eastern Southern. The schools must be eligible to receive GI Bill funding reimbursement and be approved by the FAA. Now, I dug around and I found the press release at the transportation.gov website, and it said once participants receive a CFII, they will have the ability to gain employment as flight instructors while obtaining the flight hours needed to obtain an ATP certificate and become an airline pilot. And then on another website, they have the student eligibility statement, and among other things, it says that you must have at least a high school diploma, read and speak English, have a U.S. passport, not have a private pilot's license, have never been convicted of a felony. And then it goes on to say that the person applying understands that the Forces to Flyers initiative will not cover approximately $13,500 in training costs that will be incurred within the first 12 months of training. So that's kind of interesting. It suggests to me that this program will be heavily subsidized by the U.S. government, because $13,500 would certainly not cover the cost of all the training that one might encounter over 12 months as they are working toward their CFII. I'll go ahead and include some links in the show notes so you can find out more information if you're a flight school interested in being part of the program, or if you're a veteran who'd like to be a participant. From avweb.com, another story out of Washington. It says that a bipartisan bill was introduced in the Senate last week that would provide $5 million each year from 2019 through 2023 to expand programs and apprenticeships that would train workers for careers in aviation maintenance. Quote, "Our aviation industry needs skilled workers, and the aviation maintenance industry provides high-paying, high-skilled jobs across the country," said Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma, one of the sponsors of the bill. Now, 17 aviation advocacy groups have signed a letter in support of the bill, including AOPA, GAMA, and NATA. An analysis by Boeing suggests that 118,000 new technicians will be needed in North America over the next 2 decades. The requested funding would provide grants of up to $500,000 to support workforce development initiatives such as scholarship programs, student outreach, transitioning veterans to new careers, and enhancing aviation technical education. So that's a bill in the Senate. We'll have to see if there's a matching bill in the House and whether this ultimately becomes signed into law. In international news, Voom, that's VOOM, an Airbus subsidiary, has just announced their on-demand helicopter booking service in Mexico City, which will enable commuters to fly over the traffic and save time. They say they're thrilled to launch in Mexico City, which is their second market after they introduced this service earlier in Brazil. Now, Voom has built one of the world's truly on-demand helicopter booking platforms, they say, that provides travelers the ultimate in convenience and reliability, but yet does so in an affordable way. With Voom, they say a rider can book and take off in as little as 60 minutes or plan their journey up to 7 days in advance. Now, Vooms will be available in convenient locations around Mexico City, and they mention a couple different places here, including Mexico City International Airport. They say flights will run Monday through Friday between 7:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m., and they note that Mexico City is one of the most congested cities in the world, and that there is also significant helicopter infrastructure already in place, including a dedicated helicopter air traffic control system that allows for seamless and efficient intracity air transportation. Voom also says they'll be launching in other cities worldwide later in the year, and you can learn more at voom.flights. Now, there's no .com in that. You can check this out. Just type in voom.flights, and that'll take you to their website. From Flying Magazine, a startup endeavor backed by Google co-founder Larry Page has tested an electric-powered vertical takeoff and landing drone in New Zealand. The company, Silicon Valley-based Kitty Hawk, released a video of the prototype in flight. Now, it's called the Cora, C-O-R-A. It's an autonomous craft, and it's targeting the airborne air taxi market that some experts predict could explode in the next few years. It's driven by 12 independently operated rotors that are mounted fore and aft of the wing, plus a propeller on the tail. After taking off vertically, it transitions to horizontal flight. It's been in testing since last October, and numbers show that Cora will cruise at about 80 knots for perhaps 50 nautical miles. The aircraft is being developed by Zephyr Airworks, which is Kitty Hawk's partner in New Zealand. The hope is that a full production version can reach the market within about 3 years. And finally, this comes to us from AustralianAviation.com.au, the great air race to fly electric planes between England and Australia. The Northern Territory's government in Australia is reviving an air race that was first held when such an undertaking would have been inconceivable. Way back in 1919, the Australian government challenged the world's leading aviators to fly from Great Britain to Australia in less than 30 days. First prize was £10,000, which is the equivalent of about $3 million today. It was called the Great Air Race, and 6 teams entered the contest. 3 teams crashed, 2 fatally. A 4th was imprisoned in Yugoslavia after being thought to be Bolsheviks, and just 2 crews finished, and there was only 1 winner. Now, they departed from West London, and over the next 29 days, they passed through countries including France, Italy, Greece, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan, India, Myanmar, Singapore, and Indonesia before touching down in the Northern Territory in Australia. The realization that it was possible to fly from Australia to Great Britain was part of the inspiration that spurred the founding of Qantas in 1920. Now, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Great Air Race, the Northern Territory government is backing a new Great Air Race to be held in 2019. This one will be for electric-powered aircraft with batteries to be charged using renewable energy sources such as solar and wind or by hydrogen fuel cells, with the hydrogen to be produced by renewable energy. And competitors will have to complete the journey in, you guessed it, 30 days. In January, Perth-based Electro Aero completed the first Australian flight of a production-built electric light sport aircraft with a Slovenian-built Pipistrel. And the University of New South Wales Emeritus Professor of Physics John Story said the race would help spur innovation in battery technology. Quote, "The heart of the problem is to store enough energy in the batteries without making the aircraft weigh like an elephant. The event is technically feasible, but being able to complete the route within 30 days is by no means a foregone conclusion. That makes 2019 the right time to stage it. In 2009, it would have been impossible. In 2029, it will be routine. It's a very happy coincidence." And that's the news for this week. Coming up, we're going to talk about some of the challenges pilots face entering a traffic pattern and how to follow a slow aircraft in front of you. Plus, listener feedback and questions, including one listener wants to know, does he need a life raft when he flies from Florida to the Bahamas? Stick around. We'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Welcome back. Before we talk about managing your way safely in and out of the traffic pattern, let me give you a few quick updates. Now, last week I told you that someone gave me a shout out over the tower frequency at San Jose International and said, "Love the podcast, Max." Well, this week I know who it is. The day after, I got a message over Twitter from Randy who said, "Good morning. I was listening to episode 53 this morning and I heard you mention my shout out to you on the San Jose tower frequency. I was the captain on Southwest 6436. My first officer was on the radio. I wanted to give you a quick hello and compliment. I'm glad that you heard it. Thanks for the great podcast. I own a 1966 twin Comanche, and I'm in my 26th year with Southwest, 12 years to go. Thanks again, signed Randy." Well, Randy, thanks so much for letting me know that was you. And of course, your voice only appeared once on the frequency, so I couldn't figure out who it was, and that explains why. Since the first officer was on the radio, your only comment on the radio was that shout out to me. So thanks so much for doing that. And a quick update on my near midair collision that I talked about at Stockton. I had a nice long phone call with the tower manager recently, and I was very impressed. He's clearly a very experienced person who took the incident very seriously. And he told me the report has already gone up first to regional and then to national for the Air Traffic Control Organization. I did tell him that afterwards I was still a little bit bothered by the entire incident. I think what bothered me was that the controllers involved didn't report the incident at all. And so the air traffic manager didn't know anything about the incident until I contacted him a couple of days later. So I was kind of left thinking that the controllers involved either didn't realize the seriousness of the incident or perhaps they feared getting in trouble, so they didn't report it. Neither of those options really reflect very well upon them, so I'm hoping there's some third option that I haven't considered here. But talking with the tower manager, he said that it was very much like the Swiss cheese model, which is sometimes used to describe how accidents occur, in which the holes in the different slices of cheese happen to line up so that an accident occurs. And he mentioned a couple of factors. He said that controllers and pilots rarely use runways 11 left and right. Most of the time it's runways 29, so that made things a little bit different. And he said that the student pilot who turned right in front of me said that he was going to be turning out to the east. Of course, he turned out to the north. He said that he did that rather than requesting a left crosswind departure, which would have been more standard. And it sounds like they're going to try and change their procedures at the Stockton Airport so that in the future, pilots will be asked to be more specific about their direction of flight, such as a left crosswind departure, which would be a 90-degree left turn, as opposed to a turnout to the north, which is a lot more ambiguous. So my thanks to him and everybody else involved to try and improve procedures so that I don't see anybody else turning that close to me again. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but the radar showed that we were 100 feet below the aircraft that turned in front of us, and he was about 300 feet in front of us when he pulled that left turn in front of us. Now, of course, you got to realize that the resolution for altitude is going to be just 100 feet. So it's either 0 or 100, which to me says we might have actually only been 50 or 60 feet lower than him. In any case, it was way, way, way too close. Now, here's the bizarre thing. A week later, I had yet another close encounter, which really left me a little bit perturbed. I was out at the Half Moon Bay Airport, which is right on the ocean. It's absolutely beautiful. And we were doing pattern work, interestingly, again, off of the non-standard runway, which was runway 12. Most of the time, traffic would be landing runway 30, but the winds had shifted. And literally, probably 95% of the time, people would be using the opposite runway. And in this case, we had been in the pattern for a couple loops, and we were on the departure leg, just about ready to turn crosswind, when we heard a call from two planes coming in on the 45, though they didn't say how far out they were. One was a Skylane, of course, an aircraft that's faster than the 172 that we were in. As I turned crosswind, I did spot the aircraft. It looked like we would be in front of him. So I asked if he had us in sight, and he said yes, that he did, and that he would follow us. Well, we went ahead and made our turn to the downwind, and he continued to approach right up on our right side to the point where he looked like he was flying in close formation with us. I was really stunned how close he got to our aircraft. It seemed like he wasn't more than one or two aircraft wing lengths away from us. He then abruptly pulled behind us as if he were changing lanes on a freeway. It was stunning to me how fast he kind of quickly vooped to the left and was gone out of sight. Later, I was able to pick him up in sight down below me and to the right, so he was flying a wider pattern at that point in time. And before I saw him doing that, I got on the radio and said, "Gee, you probably could have avoided getting that close to us by just flying a wider downwind." And he said, yes, that's probably true, in a way that sounded like he truly, genuinely believed that. His voice sounded a little bit shaky. I didn't know if the event left him a little shaken or if he was an older gentleman. But the aircraft recognized the tail number, and it was one from our club. We've got 48 airplanes, so often we run into other people flying our planes. So did send a note off to our safety office. I think they're going to be in touch with him. I did have a long conversation with the pilot who I was with at the time, and we talked about was there anything else we could have done. And what we concluded was that we saw the aircraft, and it appeared to us that, yes, we might be a little bit in front of him. Yes, he said he was going to follow us. But when we were on the crosswind, we could have chosen to turn a little bit more to the right, widened out, and followed him. And by doing that, that would put him in front of us, where we would then be in control of setting all the separation distance between the two of us. By going in front of him, we were then relying on him to come up with the proper amount of separation and to stay carefully spaced out from us. So it made me think that in the future, even if I am a little bit in front of another aircraft, I might consider just following them. In some ways, it's kind of like the relationship with a car that you're driving with a police car. You'd much rather be behind the police car than being in front of the police car. So I think there's some benefits perhaps sometimes to following another aircraft rather than relying upon them to establish sufficient separation from you. Well, I had another flight that was interesting as well. We've had a lot of IFR weather around here recently, a lot of rain and clouds, ice sometimes as low as 3,000 feet. On this particular day, the freezing level was right around 6,000 feet. And to get out of the San Francisco Bay Area, if you're headed out towards Stockton, the MEA is 5,000 feet. If you're headed anywhere else, you expect to be at least at 6,000 feet, sometimes 7,000 feet headed toward Salinas. And I was flying with a gentleman who was working on his instrument instructor rating, so CFII. And the aircraft we're going to be flying was his Cirrus SR22, which didn't happen to be equipped with TKS, so there's no anti-icing capability on that aircraft. And as we were talking about our plan, he said that if we were picking up ice and things weren't working out well, then we could just cancel IFR on the clouds, and that would be our out if we needed to escape the icing. Well, I wanted to talk with him about that and kind of tease out that idea more fully. And of course, ultimately, he realized that no, you can't cancel when you're in the clouds. Now, canceling IFR is actually a good solution often if you, for example, want to fly below the clouds and you have sufficient terrain clearance. But in order to do that, you can't be in the clouds when you do that. And that was something that he had briefly overlooked. And so the solution that we hit upon was, instead of heading south to Salinas, which was going to require us to climb up to 6,000 or 7,000 feet in the clouds, that we instead headed towards Stockton, where we were able to stay below the clouds at perhaps 3,000 feet and then go shoot some practice instrument approaches there. So the key thing is, anytime you think you're going to be in icing, you have to have options. You have to know what your exit plans are going to be. You've got to have that plan B or plan C. In this particular case, we didn't have TKS. So it was not a Fiki bird, that is one with flight into known icing capability. So that wasn't going to be an option. You could perhaps continue to climb to get above the clouds and get above the icing, but with a normally aspirated aircraft, of course, you're going to have less power the higher you climb. And as you pick up ice, then the aircraft is going to climb even slower. So in this particular case, we really didn't have any good options for picking up ice in the clouds, which is why we elected to not go in the clouds at all. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank and recognize our new Patreon supporters, and they include Pedro Rump, Dmitry Opolinski, Ted Panchizin, and Glenn Neeson, who increased his pledge to $8 a month. And if you love the show and you want to get more, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can see what we have there to offer. There are lots of posts and photos that I've taken while I've been flying, and anybody can view these. And speaking of the Patreon page, if you go there right now, you can see that amazing photo of the two Cirrus aircraft stacked on top of each other after one landed on top of the other one last week. And if you're thinking you'd like to be a part of this special group and support the show, you can make a contribution as little as $2 a month, and that cost will be billed to your credit card each month. And while you're on the Patreon site, just check out all the stories we have there. You can also get to it directly from your smartphone just by tapping on the artwork of your podcast app. And you'll also see our show notes there, and buried in those notes, you'll find a link to the Patreon page. Or just use a web browser and type in aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now stick around, because in 7 seconds, we're going to talk in detail about some of the challenges pilots face entering a traffic pattern and how you can follow a slower aircraft in the pattern. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's talk about entering and flying traffic patterns safely. Now, we're going to talk about both towered and non-towered airports, and of course, a lot of what we'll talk about will be the same for both. The biggest difference is at a tower, it's usually busier than a non-towered airport, but at least there's someone there who's organizing the flow. Now, here in my area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's a metro area. We have a large mix of both towered and non-towered airports, and when I see poor pilot performance in the pattern, and frankly, it's not that often, which is good, it's more likely to be at a non-towered airport. And I suspect that's perhaps because pilots just don't do as much planning ahead of time that they need to do before they arrive at the airport. But I also have a theory. Now, this is just a generalization, so of course it's not true all the time. But I think in these kind of metro areas, that pilots with the poorer skills tend to stay away from towered airports. Perhaps they feel that they're more likely to make a mistake there and perhaps get in trouble. And also, I think these errors tend to be from really low-time pilots, student pilots, low-time private pilots, and occasionally perhaps older folks who are just not flying that often. And by the way, I count myself among pilots who, when I was relatively low-time as a private pilot, was sometimes clueless about traffic patterns. So let me give you a personal example of a problem that I had a couple of years after I got my private. Now, I learned to fly at a single runway, non-towered airport in northern Pennsylvania in a very rural area. And in my first job out of college, I lived in New Jersey, and the northern part of the state, and I flew mostly out of Hackettstown, which is also a non-towered airport. And one day I decided to fly to Mercer County Airport in Trenton, which was a towered airport. They have two intersecting runways, runway 6 and 24 and runway 1634. I was arriving from the north and seemed to recall that I was first offered a base entry to runway 6. Even though it's been over 30 years, I remember being west of the field at the time. And I was confused by the layout, and I had trouble identifying the runways. And by the time I was able to figure out which runway was which, I was flying right over the top of the runway 6 numbers at pattern altitude. Well, Tower then offered me an entry to a different runway that I don't recall, which I also bungled. And finally, I seem to remember the tower controller saying, "Clear to land any runway." I was a little embarrassed, but I was also extremely grateful. Now, when I look at the chart today for that airport, I see 2 runways, but I would have sworn that there was a third one there 30 years ago, but probably not. It just seemed the airport was very complicated compared to the rural single runway airports at which I had done the vast amount of my flying as a student and later as a low-time private pilot. But the biggest issue was that I just showed up at the airport and somehow expected to figure it out on the fly. Instead of that, if you do some planning before you show up, things tend to work out much better. So let's start by talking about how to prepare in advance for landing at a destination airport, particularly one that's new to you. Step 1, I think, is to really learn everything you can about your destination airport. Now, in the past, we had many fewer tools to learn about an airport, and I'm sure when I went to Mercer County Airport, I was armed with just a sectional map and nothing more. Now, from that, I could have only guessed at what the runway numbers were, as they aren't marked on the sectional charts. And yes, if there's a right traffic pattern to an airport, you will now see the letters RP followed by a runway number. But back then, as I recall, right patterns were not marked on sectionals, so you had zero information on runway numbers other than a guess by looking at the orientation on the sectional. Now, these days, of course, you can go to the internet and look up tons of information about an airport before you ever get there. You can also go into Google Maps and get a bird's eye view of the airport before you leave the ground. And of course, there are many apps that you can bring along with you so that you have all that information in the airplane with you. So it's much easier today to learn about your destination airport, meaning you no longer have an excuse for just showing up at an airport and trying to figure it out when you get there, which is essentially what I did so many years ago at the Mercer County Airport in Trenton. Well, step 2, and this is again before you ever leave the ground, just try to envision 1 or 2 or more possible ways that you might join the traffic pattern to land at the airport. Now, at towered airports, they'll often let you fly a traffic pattern from the side that's closest to you as you arrive at the airport. It's really pretty rare that they'll tell you to cross the field to get to the downwind on the opposite side, but it does happen, especially at airports with some noise considerations. For example, at the nearby San Carlos airport, if you're approaching from the ocean, they seem to always want you to cross over the field first before joining the right downwind, which takes you over very few houses and businesses, whereas a left downwind would have you flying low over the downtown. So I think that's why they usually have you cross over the field. And towered airports often won't make you fly the full traffic pattern, which would be to enter on the 45, fly the downwind, the base, and the final, as we would typically do at a non-towered airport. Instead, if you're lined up to land straight in, they'll often let you land straight in. And if you're approaching the runway from a right angle, they may have you enter on a base entry, in which case you don't want to fly directly to the midfield of the airport, but instead you want to steer to a point that's perhaps 1 or 2 miles outside the runway end so that you'll be properly lined up for base entry. And of course, if as you approach a towered airport, you're fairly lined up for downwind entry, they'll often tell you just to enter on the downwind. Now, if you're flying to a non-towered airport, something we talked about in detail back in episode 24, generally you're going to want to enter on the 45 and fly the full traffic pattern. Though if you are lined up for a straight in, many pilots will fly that, but you should only do that if there isn't other traffic which is flying the recommended traffic pattern. Of course, for larger, faster aircraft, it's generally safer to let them do a straight in approach even if you are in the pattern. So pilots on a downwind might offer to extend their downwind and then follow the faster aircraft that's making the straight in approach. Now, from a planning standpoint, before you leave the ground, find out if your destination airport uses left or right traffic for the runways you think you're most likely to use. Then determine whether the traffic pattern is on the side of the airport from which you are approaching. If it is, then you'll know long before you get there that you'll be more or less lined up to enter the preferred traffic pattern. But if the preferred traffic pattern is on the opposite side of the airport from the direction from which you'll be arriving, then you'll know in advance that you'll need to first cross over the airport before maneuvering to enter the preferred traffic pattern. If you figure this out in advance, then it makes it much easier to fly a proper pattern when you arrive at a non-towered airport. Now, step 3 is to identify runways at your destination airport. That was the problem I had when I arrived at Mercer County Airport so many years ago. No one had ever given me any guidance on how to identify a runway other than to fly overhead and look down at the numbers, which isn't very convenient if you're going to a towered airport, but it does work fairly well at a non-towered airport. That is, provided you're 1,000 feet above the traffic pattern while you're looking down at the numbers. Now, here's one way you might consider using to help yourself identify runways as you approach an airport in the air. By the time I start to see the airport, I already have a good idea of which runway I'll be landing on because I've listened to the ATIS or the AWOS, or I'm in contact with the tower if it's a towered airport. Now, knowing which runway I'm planning to use, I'll take a pen or a pencil, or you can even use your finger, and then I place it over the heading indicator. Now, that's the gyro instrument on the panel that looks very much like a stable compass. Or if I'm in a glass cockpit, I'll place it over the HSI. That's the horizontal situation indicator, which essentially performs the same function. And I'll place the pen so that one end over top of this compass heading indicator corresponds with the runway on which I plan to land. Then, knowing the orientation of the runway, all I have to do is look straight ahead out the window for a runway that's roughly oriented in the same direction as my pen or pencil. And if there are multiple runways, even if I can't see all of the runways at first, this technique helps me eliminate some of the runways that I do see as I'm looking at the airport. And I've noticed that sometimes low-time pilots will just go ahead and assume that the only runway they see out there is the one that they're planning to go to. So this really helps you eliminate doing that. So the 3 steps are to 1, research ahead of time the runway numbers at your destination. 2, envision 1 or more possible ways that you might join the traffic pattern to land on the runways there. And 3, when you're in the air, put a pen on your heading indicator so that you know the orientation of the runway and then match it up with what you see out the window. Now let's talk about entering on the 45. If you're at a towered airport and they say to make right traffic, that means you are to enter on the 45, not the downwind or the base. And on the 45, you are essentially pointed at the center of the airport at an angle approximately 45 degrees off of the downwind leg that you'll be joining. And at a towered airport, you'll always know your sequence in which aircraft you are to follow. So while you're on the 45, the tower may say, follow the aircraft on downwind abeam of the tower, and that aircraft would be more or less directly in front of you when you're on the 45. Or they might say, widen out the right to follow an aircraft on the downwind, and that aircraft is probably slightly to your right, which is why they want you to turn more to the right to follow that aircraft. Now, years ago, I was in the Palo Alto Tower visiting with the staff, and I asked, what's the one thing that bugs you most about GA pilots? And they said, without thinking about it, the Cirrus pilots who come blasting into the traffic pattern at high speed. Now, there are other fast aircraft to which the same thing would apply, but since Cirrus is the best-selling piston aircraft, it's not surprising they singled out Cirrus when they mentioned this. So when I'm teaching pilots to fly a fast aircraft like a Cirrus, I'm always coaching them to slow down before they enter the traffic pattern, or in fact, before they even enter the class Delta. By that I mean, I want them to be below 120 knots while they're on the 45, which means that they'll be slow enough to lower the flaps to 50% flaps in any model of Cirrus. And when I tell pilots they need to slow up before they enter the traffic pattern, I explain to them that there are many slower aircraft in the pattern. For example, we have a number of Citabrias used for flight training at Palo Alto, and on final, these aircraft may be flying slower than 60 knots. Of course, so would a Cessna 152 or a Skycatcher. So when I explain it to pilots, I tell them they don't want to be blasting into the pattern at high speed and scattering the other aircraft around like chickens. Now, of course, that wouldn't really happen, but I think that mental image helps them to realize that while their plane is capable of doing 180 knots on the 45, that rarely makes sense to do. Now, one of the benefits of flying at a towered airport is the tower is responsible for the sequence of the aircraft. So you should be hearing from them that you're number 1, you're number 2, and so on. And if you're on downwind and are about to turn base and you haven't been given your sequence, well, it's time to call the tower and ask, what's our sequence? Because you never really want to turn base without knowing your sequence, because there could be an aircraft on a long straight-in final that you're unaware of that the tower is planning to sequence in front of you. And you don't want to cut out that traffic by turning base if the tower hasn't gotten around to giving you your sequence by the time you're turning base. So definitely ask the tower for your sequence. While the tower is responsible for sequence, pilots are responsible for the separation between themselves and the aircraft ahead of them. Now, sometimes I hear a pilot have to go around because there's an aircraft still on the runway, and their comments or their tone of voice indicates that they believe the pilot on the runway is somehow responsible for this. Now, that is rarely the case unless the aircraft has come to a complete stop of the runway or is moving exceedingly slowly. It's the pilot that had to go around who was responsible for spacing his aircraft out from the plane in front of him so that there was enough space that he didn't have to go around. So how do you do that if you're in a Cirrus SR22 or a Bonanza and you've got an approach speed of 80 knots and you're following a Citabria flying final at 56 knots? Well, do that first by listening carefully on the frequency and plan ahead. It's really rare that you're going to show up on final and only then discover that there's a slow aircraft in front of you if you've been listening carefully to everything on the frequency from the time you started to enter the traffic pattern. Now, as you approach any airport, regardless of whether it's towered or non-towered, you want to build a mental map of all the aircraft in the area. And that mental map includes where each aircraft is located now, what type of aircraft it is, and hence whether it's likely to be faster or slower than you, and what are their intentions and hence where they're likely to fly to next. Knowing that, you can start to figure out whether there are any potential conflicts ahead and whether you're likely to have a slower aircraft ahead of you when you turn onto the final. Now let's talk about potential conflicts. Let's say you're in the traffic pattern at a non-towered airport. You've just taken off, you haven't turned crosswind yet, and then you hear a plane announce that it's inbound on the 45. Now that aircraft may arrive in the downwind at the same point in time that you get there, so you'll need to be watching carefully for it and decide what to do when it gets there. Now let's take the example I had last week at Half Moon Bay, where I was on the crosswind and an aircraft announced he was on the 45. I knew that it was a potential conflict because I'd been building a mental map, and when the pilot called in that he was inbound on the 45, I realized that that was now a conflict. And when I spotted him, it appeared to me that we would clearly be on the downwind before him, which is why I asked if he would follow us. By the way, I just happened to look at AOPA's Safety Advisor publication called Operations at Non-Towered Airports, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And it says that traffic on the 45 is supposed to yield to traffic on the downwind, something, frankly, I don't remember reading before, and something that's probably not common knowledge among pilots. Regardless, as I said earlier, I think I now would be more inclined to just widen out and follow someone who's close in on the 45, simply so that I can now control the amount of separation between our two aircraft. Now, as you build that mental map of aircraft in the vicinity of the airport, you'll want to figure out whether you're likely to have a slower aircraft ahead of you when you turn on to final. And usually you can figure that out long before you turn final, just by listening carefully to every transmission on the frequency. But what do you do if you're in a faster plane and you find your sequence behind a really slow aircraft ahead of you? Well, the first thing you can do is fly a wider downwind that's outside of the slower aircraft. And that's what I suggested to the pilot at Half Moon Bay that he could have done to avoid getting so close to us. And to his credit, he agreed when I mentioned that to him over the radio. You'll see twin-engine aircraft and jets do this all the time. One benefit of flying a wider downwind is that you don't have to slow to match the aircraft speed in front of you, because you might actually end up passing a slower aircraft, which would be a big problem if you were directly behind them, but it's totally a non-issue if you're flying a much wider downwind leg that's outside of the aircraft that you're following. Next, note carefully when the slow aircraft in front of you turns base. Then continue to fly the downwind for however far you think you need to go until you've created enough distance between you and the plane in front of you so that when you're ready to land, you won't have to go around. Spacing yourself out sufficiently from the plane in front of you is much easier to do if you have a traffic system in the plane that gives an accurate distance between you and the plane in front of you. So in general, when I'm flying a faster plane, I find that I'd like to have about 2 miles of separation between me and the plane in front of me in the pattern. If that separation decreases to 1.5 miles as I approach, well, it might still work out, but now there's some chance I'll need to go around. And if the separation decreases to 1 mile, well, now there's a really good chance I'll need to go around, especially if the airplane is doing a full stop. However, if they're doing a touch and go, 1 mile separation will probably be enough. But often we don't know in advance whether the aircraft in front of us is doing a touch and go or doing a full stop. So having that full 2 miles of separation is very helpful to me. Now, these are distances that work well for me in the faster Cirrus aircraft I'm usually flying. And you might find that if you're in a 172 following another 172, you don't need nearly that much distance between you and the aircraft in front of you. Now, what if for some reason you find yourself on final and you're clearly too close to the aircraft in front of you? What should you do? My recommendation is that you go around. Sometimes you'll hear a tower offer that you can do S-turns on final to create more space, but now you're creating an unstable approach and increasing the chance you'll have a bad landing. So I'm not a big fan of doing S-turns on final, and I discourage you from doing it, especially if you're anywhere close to the runway. And for sure, never just decide on your own to do S-turns without first having permission from the tower. If you unilaterally decide to do S-turns, you may have just screwed up the chance of the plane behind you from being able to land. So when you take any action in the traffic pattern, be mindful of your impact on the actions of others that may be in the traffic pattern. And by the way, if you find that you do have to do a go-around, it's a good idea to offset your aircraft a little bit to the right so that you can keep the runway in view below you and to the left. That way you can monitor the activity of any plane that might be climbing out next to you and below you. That airplane probably can't see you, so you'll need to watch them and maneuver as necessary if they start to climb up next to you. Now let's talk briefly about parallel runways. The stakes really go up because now if you don't pay attention to what you're doing, there's a greater chance that there's someone close by that you might hit. And there are lots of ways to have problems with parallel runways. One is just identifying the correct runway. Years ago, I was landing at San Jose International for the first time when they used to have 3 parallel runways. And when I looked out the window, I saw 5 runways, and I just couldn't figure out why I was seeing 5 instead of 3. Now, you might guess that I was looking at the taxiways, which is one possible way to be confused, but that's not what I was doing. It turns out there had been so many jets that had landed on the 2 main runways, the 30 left and 30 right, and they'd left huge black areas in the center of the runway from their tires leaving rubber on the pavement, and that from a long distance, those black marks seemed to divide the runways into 2 separate runways. So 30 left and 30 right looked like 4 runways to me. Now, obviously, as you're approaching to land on parallel runways, you need to avoid the area between the two runways. So it's important as you make the base to final turn that you don't overshoot the final. To avoid doing that, I'll often start my turn early to final and then come in at a gentle angle of perhaps 30 degrees. That makes it very easy to precisely join the final and just about completely eliminates the possibility of overshooting. Now, on departure, I'm always looking for aircraft on the parallel runway and watching them very carefully throughout the departure, which is what saved my bacon with that near mid-air collision I had 2 weeks ago at the Stockton airport. And if it's a large aircraft, I'll also be thinking about any wake turbulence they may be throwing my way and how I need to fly to avoid it. One way to avoid it is to turn so that I'm flying maybe 10 or 20 degrees away from the other craft, which usually I can do unless it's a towered airport and I've been told to fly at runway heading. Well, there you have it. Tips for flying and entering the traffic pattern safely. Coming up next, lots of listener feedback and questions. One listener wants to know, is there an official wings insignia for flight instructors? We'll be right back. Welcome back. We'll get to listener feedback and questions in just a second, but first I want to thank people who left reviews in the Apple Podcast app, formerly called iTunes. Pilot Bill from Texas left a review titled Great Aviation Podcast, and DesertPilot.com left a nice review titled Great Listen. Thanks to both of you for doing that. And no new reviews on our dedicated iPhone app for Aviation News Talk, but let me go ahead and mention something about that. Most people, it looks like, just give it a few stars without actually writing a review. So here's what you can do if you want to write a review. Go to the Apple App Store, search for Aviation News Talk, then tap on the words Aviation News Talk, then click on Reviews, and then click on Write a Review. And it's not real obvious, but below where it says tap the stars to rate it, in very faint letters it says title, where you can type in the title for a review, and below that it says review. So if somebody would like to go out and do that, we would love to get some more reviews for our dedicated iOS app for the show. And we'll have more news coming up on dedicated apps next week. Let's get to listener feedback. This comes to us from Rob in Ohio. He says, "Hi, Max. Love the show. I listen to every one when it comes into Overcast, which is a podcast app. Regarding the hot air balloon incident in California mentioned, I wanted to add some additional insight since I crew for hot air balloons regularly. The local balloon DPE told the Worldwide Balloon newsletter that the pilots had called the sheriff's office in advance of the flight. I'm not familiar with the Yucaipa area, but it sounds like balloons are not a common sight. Flying directly above homes in our buildings is a very normal thing for balloons. The fact that a law enforcement official was disrupting a pilot in the process of flying his aircraft is a bit troubling. Just my 2 cents. And I sent Rob a note back thanking him for listening, and I told him I think that the typical reaction of law enforcement when they encounter something they don't understand is to try and give an order to stop it. And I can think of a couple aviation-related incidents where that's occurred. But interesting, the sheriff's department was notified in advance in this particular case, and apparently it still didn't help. Here's an email from Natalie in Ohio. She said, listen to the last podcast. You mentioned the Flight Radar 24 app provided an alert to the United flight that was squawking 7700. I thought that was pretty cool, so I got the app last night. Literally woke up to an alert for a 7700 for a flight call sign IG0055 and A320. Love the podcast. And Natalie, I'm sorry it woke you up, but I'm glad you're enjoying the app. But I mentioned to her that most of the alerts I see on that app tend to be for Europe, so I don't know why there aren't more alerts for the U.S. on that app. Here's an email from Richard in Amarillo, Texas. He says, been listening since your first show. Well, thanks so much for that, Richard. He said, I listened while building an RV-7A in my workshop. I fly out of Amarillo with the Civil Air Patrol, and my ears perked up when you talked about landing here. I assume since you were coming from the north and based on the prevailing winds, I'm thinking you were over or near one of the very few prohibited areas in the U.S., that's P-47. Although you and Chuck mentioned some interesting things about the Amarillo airport, you may not know that you flew over or near P-47. That facility is why I'm living in Amarillo, and some research on the word Pantex will reveal another interesting thing about the Amarillo area. And Richard, no, I didn't notice P-47, probably because we were getting a flight following from Amarillo approach, and they steered us well to the south and east of that area, but thanks for mentioning that. For listeners who are interested, Pantex is one of 6 facilities run by the National Nuclear Security Administration's Nuclear Security Enterprise. Wow, that's a mouthful. And they are the primary facility for the final assembly, dismantlement, and maintenance of nuclear weapons. Here's an email from Dan, who's a Patreon sponsor. He says, thanks for the message and the mention on the show. I live vicariously through you. I especially enjoyed the episode in which you picked up a new Cirrus. You brought along a real-world adventure, especially with all the routing changes. I really appreciate and respect you for talking about missing the frequency switch to Tower 2. It's so easy to feel a real connection with you and a great object lesson in learning from mistakes, acknowledging that nobody is perfect. Yes, Dan, I'm glad you enjoyed my sharing my screw-up with the tower in Amarillo. I think it's pretty important for people to know that even somebody like me who flies 6 days a week can occasionally have a major screw-up, and things like that also keep me on my toes to try and think of ways that I can improve my processes so that I try to avoid these pitfalls in the future, and I hope that's what listeners do as well. Now let's take some listener questions.
Hey Max, quick question about flying international over water, for example, from Florida to Bimini. In the US, in the FAR, for example, if I went from Miami to Key West over water, there's no regulation for a small airplane like a 172 to carry life vests or life preservers. Of course, it's a good idea, but I'm just wondering about the legalities here. On the other hand, I can't find any sort of international ICAO type rules that say you must have a life preserver or raft if I'm going over water internationally. So if you can just clarify this, that'd be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks for your question. You didn't leave your name, so I can't thank you personally here. But you are correct. If you look at the FAR's 91.205 says that if an aircraft is operated for hire over water and beyond power-off gliding distance from the shore, approved flotation gear must be readily available to each occupant, and you have to have at least one pyrotechnic signaling device on board. If you're not operating for hire, which would be standard kind of Part 91 flying for fun kind of thing, this rule doesn't apply, which means, yeah, you can do whatever you want. And I don't think you're going to find any international regulations because, frankly, you're in international waters, and I don't know that there are additional rules that are added to aircraft who are flying in international waters. I think they typically fly under the rules of their own country or the country they happen to be over at that time. But, you know, your question really gets at an issue that we have with many FARs, which is the distinction between what's legal versus what's safe. And so you have, I think, correctly determined that it's legal for you to fly with no flotation equipment as you go to Florida. But you want to ask, is that the safest thing you could do? And if you decide that maybe you want to bring along some flotation devices, that's a great idea. I think often when we look at the FARs, we find that there is a higher standard for aircraft that are being used for hire because the general public doesn't know what risk they are facing. And so the FAA requires aircraft operators to do additional things to guarantee the safety of people who are paying to be on board the aircraft. Now, if it's just you and your friends, you probably know what risk you're facing. Therefore, the FAA doesn't put these additional requirements upon you. So I'll be interested in knowing what you decide to do. And here's an email from Robert in Southern California. He says, Max, you mentioned accelerated flight training in a past episode for multi-engine ratings. Are there any organizations that you recommend? And I hate to ask, but are there any that you don't recommend? Thank you. Well, Robert, thanks for your question. I can tell you that I have used Shebley Aviation in Las Vegas a couple of times in the past with good results. I got my initial twin-engine rating there, and I also got my ATP multi-engine rating there. Two key things I would ask any accelerated multi-school, and I would ask Shebley as well, how many planes and how many instructors do you currently have? And perhaps most importantly, what's the lead time for you to schedule a check ride with an examiner? Now, those numbers change constantly for all these schools as instructors come and go and airplanes come and go. And even though I've had great experience with Shebley in the past, hey, I'm sure there have been periods of time when people have been sitting around waiting because they had more students there than they had instructors. And I think that's probably the case with almost all of these schools. So it's a dynamic situation. It really pays for you to investigate and try and understand what's the current situation right now at a particular school that you're considering for accelerated multi-engine rating. And here's an email from Tony in Nevada. He says, hello, I just started listening to your podcast. I recently passed my single-engine land private pilot check ride. Hey, congratulations, Tony. He says, I'm fortunate enough to have a CNC machine. That's a computer numerical control machine, so something that's run essentially by a computer that can cut metal. And he says, I want to make a gift for my CFI. He says, I am searching for an image of CFI wings. Is there such a thing? I'm in the Air Force, and I am accustomed to every job having its specific badge or wings that represent represent it. I would appreciate it if you can point me in the right direction, because I would like to make my CFI a memento to thank her for her dedication. Well, Tony, I think that's an awesome idea. What a great idea for a gift. I think any CFI would be interested in a gift from their students, and that sounds pretty special if you make it yourself. I did a little bit of searching, and I can't find anything that's official for CFIs. If you look at the CFI certificate, there is no CFI emblem on there. So I did send Tony some images of some generic pilot wings that I found on the internet, and suggested you might want to try and copy some of those. So Tony, good luck with the project, and let us know how that works out. And with that, let me encourage you to listen to bloopers at the end of the show. But also, if you have a question that you would like answered on this show, just click on the artwork on your podcast player, and you'll find my contact information and a link where you can go to record a question from your smartphone, or just send me an email. You can find my contact information in the show notes, or by going to aviationnewstalk.com and clicking on Contact at the top of the page. And here's the one thing I always ask. If you know somebody who you think might enjoy the show, please let them know about it. That's how we grow this show. And if they're not familiar with what a podcast is, just send them to the Apple App Store, type in Aviation News Talk, and download our dedicated app. And if you think that someday you might be interested in buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now. You can just pick up the phone or send me an email, and I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new aircraft, but also help you understand some of the different trade-offs if you're thinking about a new versus a slightly used Cirrus. I specialize in the Cirrus SR20 and SR22 and work with people literally around the world. Hey, until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And here's an email from Robert in Southern California. He says, on a past episode, you mentioned accelerated flight training for multi-engine rating. Are there any organizations that you recommend? I hate to ask, but there are. Wah, wah, wah.